Chapter 2. The Provisional Government. In Petersburg, I found that excitement had reached a higher pitch than ever. From morning till night, and from night till morning, the streets were crowded, especially with soldiers, who were strolling about aimlessly. Red ribbons had gone out of fashion, but untidiness and carelessness were increasing noticeably. The soldiers passed their time in eating sunflower seeds, staring at the officers without saluting them, and jostling passers-by. Endless meetings were held all over the place, at the Tauride Palace, in the riding schools, the barracks, the town hall, the schools, and elsewhere, especially in public places and at the crossroads. Those who had been forced to be silent for centuries now burned to make up for lost time. In the theaters and the cinemas, there was invariably some babbler who would stand on a chair and harangue the audience during the intervals. The press was overflowing with articles, and it was always the same old story: the peaceful revolution, the struggle for liberty, the safeguarding of the privileges already won. There was no longer any mention of the welfare of Russia, only of the welfare of the conquests of the revolution. The struggle between the government and the Soviet went on. To give the demagogues their due, they made for their goal straightforwardly, while the right wing of the government shuffled and vied in cunning with the Bolsheviks, supported and subsidized as they were by Germany. They had seized the hotel of the dancer Chasinska in broad daylight and were preaching peace from its balcony. The government trembled and took no action. The old ministers and the former higher officials were in prison, not because they had been accused of sedition against the new government, but simply because such was the good pleasure of the revolutionary democracy. The government, or rather the Soviet, suppressed the conservative newspapers, whilst the press of the left continued its campaign against the army. Investigations were the order of the day. A search was made even in the house of the Dowager Empress, who lived in the Crimea, and this, mark you, by order of the authorities. And these gentlemen of the government, who till recently had been reproaching the Tsar for his weakness and despotism, now showed themselves to be far weaker, far more irresolute than he had been, and much more foolish than the high officials of the regime they had overthrown. On April 20th, the Red Guard marched against the government for the first time, and the government did not yield an inch. At the corner of the Nevsky and the Mikhailovskaya, some passers-by were killed. I saw it all from the restaurant where I was having lunch. The crowd scattered at top speed. The cab drivers lashed their old hacks to a gallop. The scoundrels, with faces like gallows birds, marched off to the strains of the International. The public, furious with the Red Guard, were loudly accusing the government of weakness. I walked along to the Ministry of War, where I found the leader of the cabinet, Colonel Samarin, our former chief of staff. "Well, Colonel," I said, "so you are not offering any resistance." "The government cannot shed Russian blood," he answered. "If blood is spilt, the government will lose its moral prestige in the eyes of the people for good and all." The next day, the Soviet published a signed order forbidding the troops to leave their barracks without permission. On May 5th, a demonstration was made by the troops, which were still loyal to the government, but that apathetic and impotent power did not know how to use them. To be absolutely truthful, I must admit that almost the entire population of the capital remained quite passive in the face of everything that happened. They did not seem to notice anything. Some posed as conspirators and spoke of the necessity for organizing themselves, but no one ever dreamt of doing it. In the army, thanks to the initiative of Generals Alexeyev and Denikin, there were already officers' societies. There was one in Petersburg, too, but it did more harm than good. It was scarcely established before it was divided into two hostile camps. Those who hoped to fish in troubled waters declared their adherence to the revolution. In some way or another, the confusion had to be checked, and above all, a man had to be found whom the majority would accept as leader. A man popular with the army, who could lead the troops if necessary and rely on the support of their bayonets. I considered only two men suitable toward this role: General Lechitsky, the commander-in-chief of the Ninth Army, and General Kornilov, both of them brave, enterprising, distinguished men, and both adored by the army. Lechitsky, disgusted with the course things had taken, had sent in his resignation and was living as a private person. Kornilov at this time was commanding the troops in the capital, a particularly favorable circumstance. I got into touch with other officers on whom I could rely, and soon we were numerous enough to be able to begin work. Suddenly, at the beginning of May, General Kornilov definitely broke with the Soviet and left his post. He accepted the command of the 8th Army, which was in Galicia. Amongst others, General Lechitsky was nominated as successor to General Kornilov. I decided to speak to him. I explained the position and said that we were at his disposal and that we had money enough to meet the initial expenses. I added that, once Kornilov had left, he would be nominated as before to replace him, and I begged him not to refuse the post. "I agree with your point of view," Lechitsky said to me. "I support your program, as every soldier will. But I will not succeed Kornilov. I have left the army for good. I am only an old soldier, and nothing more than a soldier. To make a success of the task you have outlined to me, it is not enough to be firm and honest. You must be able to adapt yourself to circumstances. No, it needs a younger man than I." I knew the general too well to insist. A few days later, General Kornilov left the capital and was replaced by General Polovtsev of the Caucasian Division. Although he had gone away, Kornilov still kept in touch with the capital. A certain Zawoyko, his orderly officer, was his go-between. I did not know this gentleman personally, but Colonel Count Polin and Lieutenant Count Shuvalov, who shared my opinions, knew him well. They introduced us. Zawoyko seemed to me to be intelligent and energetic, but insincere. Did the sequel prove me wrong? Nevertheless, as I knew him to be Kornilov's confidant, I spoke freely to him and told him what we had already succeeded in doing. And from that time on, Kornilov was kept informed of our actions and movements. The army of the day after tomorrow would have to take the offensive again, and the whole town, as well as the enemy, knew it. Guchkov had resigned, and the new Minister of War, Kerensky, had struggled into possession. He harangued the troops, urging them in ringing tones to save the revolution. New contingents and many reinforcements were on the march, preceded by placards with such inscriptions as "War to the finish," "Death is better than slavery," and similar tags. But it was only rarely that these reinforcements reached their destination. Usually, the contingents which were ready to die to save the revolution took themselves off on the way. On June 18th, the armies on the southwest front attacked the enemy. Kornilov's 8th Army invaded Galicia. A breach was made in the enemy's ranks, and the Russian army was master of Galich and Stanislavov. It seemed that after long months of anguish, we were at last to be victorious. On June 30th, 1917, a telegram from headquarters informed me that at last I had been appointed commander of the 7th Cavalry Division in Kornilov's army. That same day, I went to join my division, leaving Count Polin at the head of the group of which I have spoken earlier, and taking Shuvalov with me in order to leave him with Kornilov, who needed him. 2. The Revolutionary Army on the offensive. I reached Kamenets-Podolsk on July 6th and found bad news awaiting me. There was a telegram from Kerensky, couched in the following words: "The Revolutionary Army's admirable beginning has ended in the treason of the Grenadiers of the Guard and the general rout of the 11th Army, which is marching towards the interior. The enemy have taken Tarnopol and are threatening the flank and rear of the 8th Army, which Kornilov is commanding. The battalions in the encounter, mostly composed of officers, died like heroes, but the Democratic Army saw no point in imitating them or in dying to save the revolution, and have scattered like a flock of sheep. The generals, deprived of all their forces, are powerless. In face of the danger which threatened them, the inefficient Provisional Government seemed to realize that revolutionary élan was not enough, and that discipline also was necessary. The appointment of General Kornilov as Commander-in-Chief of the Southeastern Front seemed to confirm this. I had hoped to find General Kornilov still with the army, and Count Shuvalov and I went immediately to Kolomea, where I thought we should find him. Colonel Count Hayden, who was on his staff, told me that the general was still at the front, would not be back till the evening, and was leaving the next day for his new headquarters. I learnt from Count Hayden that my division, Alveopol Lancers, White Russian Hussars, Kinborn Dragoons, and the 2nd Don Cossacks, had not yet been completely disorganized by democratization. My predecessor, as well as one of the colonels, had already been forced to leave. But as the officers' corps was excellent, and the regiments were sound on the whole, it would not be difficult to take them in hand again. Whilst we were talking, a young civilian in a brand new tunic with a rakish cap and a soldierly manner came into the room. The Count introduced us. It was M. Filinenko, commissioner and delegate from the 8th Army. There and then, with extraordinary self-assurance, he began to speak of our military operations and strategy. According to him, he had helped considerably in the maintenance of discipline, and he implied that he was largely responsible for the appointment of the commander-in-chief. He promised me his help and protection too, if, by any chance, I wanted to get rid of any officers and soldiers or of any committees of the troops. He was at my service. I knew Kornilov personally through having dined with him once at the Tsar's table in Mogilev, and I had spent an hour or two in the same railway carriage with him. Small, spare, swarthy, of the Mongolian type, with a little goatee beard and a black mustache, he spoke in short, abrupt sentences. One had only to see him to realize that he was a man of indomitable energy and great breadth of mind. I told him that I was proceeding with the organization of the capital and offered to leave Shuvalov with him if he cared to have him. He kept him as his orderly officer. The general, who was due to leave for his new headquarters in a few hours' time, invited me to dinner and introduced me to his successor, General Cheremissov, who struck me as being intelligent, but who never looked one straight in the face. My impressions were limited to these, for during the meal we spoke only of unimportant matters. After dinner, General Kornilov set out for his headquarters and I for my division. When I arrived, I had barely had time to review the Hussar regiment when there came an order from General Cheremissov ordering me to go immediately to Stanislavov, which he had just reached. My division was to proceed towards this town and cover the flank of the 8th Army, which was retreating all along the line. I gave the necessary orders to the brigade commander, who was to take my place whilst I was away, and set off in my car. I arrived at nightfall. The general staff was just leaving. They were looking for wagons, removing telephones, and striking camp. The tram which was to take the general away was in the station. About 100 wagons and lorries followed one after the other. General Cheremissov explained the situation to me. The whole army was in full retreat, harassed by the enemy, who was at its heels. The only position it was possible to take up was at Zbuch. I was put at the head of 2 divisions, my own and the 3rd Division of Caucasian Cossacks. Together, they formed a cavalry troop, which was to maneuver on the flanks of the 7th and 8th Armies and to cover their retreat. I wanted to await the arrival of my own division, which was marching on Stanislavov, so that I could give them the necessary orders, and then to rejoin the Caucasian Division, which was operating in the Monastirsk zone, where I intended to concentrate the whole corps. That night I was awakened by a fiendish din. There were screams and shots. I ran to the window. The town was on fire. I was dressing hastily when an orderly came in. "Your Excellency, it's a pogrom. The retreating soldiers are ransacking the town." In the hall, leaning against the wall, was an old man with a long white beard, all covered with blood. A disheveled and almost naked young woman was weeping and wringing her hands. She seized my hands and tried to kiss them, screaming, sobbing, and speaking a dialect I could not understand. I appealed to the porter to act as interpreter. He told me that the old man was a Jew, the owner of a shop which had been looted. He had been roughly handled and had escaped death only by a miracle. There were only my orderly and 2 hussars near at hand. We went into the street. Pillaging was going on everywhere. Windows were being broken, doors smashed in, furniture destroyed, boxes forced open, materials and household articles covered the roadways and obstructed the ammunition wagons, lorries, and ambulances. Fires were smoldering all over the place. A spark was enough to cause severe trouble. An artillery officer I met gave me some men, and I attempted to restore order. Coming upon a group of fugitives engaged in rifling a shop, I struck one of them violently with my fist and felled him to the ground. My 2 hussars also hit out. I called out, "Cossacks, see that this scoundrel is flogged," and the whole lot took themselves off. With the assistance of the gunners, the streets were cleared in 2 hours, and the artillery and transport were able to get on the march. In the side streets, looting still went on. I had done so much shouting that I had lost my voice. With the dawn, a squadron of lancers arrived. I commanded the colonel who was with them to put an end to the pogrom, no matter what the cost. He had a few of the pillagers shot down, and order was restored. I got into a car and set off to rejoin my Cossack division. Amongst the officers attached to the divisional staff, I came across the former Minister of War, Gauchkov, who had just joined up. The army was in retreat all along the line. As for Monastergisk, which was occupied by one of my regiments, there was a big munition depot there, and headquarters had sent along an engineering officer with orders to destroy it. I was just having dinner when I learnt that my Ossetines were at grips with the enemy in Monastergisk. I motored over there with my chief of staff. As we approached the town, we saw a huge column of smoke mounting skywards. Then there was an explosion which shook the ground. It was followed by a second and a third. The town was on fire. We met about 100 men with herds of cattle in full flight. On inquiry, we discovered that the engineering officer, and seeing the enemy approaching, had set fire to the depots without first warning the troops, who were skirmishing on the outskirts of the town. More than a dozen of the cavalry and the colonel of the regiment had been killed, victims of a piece of criminal negligence. That evening, the enemy entered the town, and I took up a position some versts to the east. At dawn, the enemy attacked all along the line. For hours, all their efforts were in vain. Towards evening, the Germans managed to make themselves masters of a village occupied by a detachment of my kin-born dragoons and threatened us with a breach. I ordered the other squadrons of the regiment to attack. The Germans were beaten. We took some prisoners and captured some machine guns. By nightfall, the danger was over, and I retired, covering the infantry. The infantry was still retreating all along the line. Discipline was gone, and numerous stragglers were looting every place they passed through. My corps was maneuvering on the flanks of the 7th and 8th Armies, and was gradually passing over to the offensive. This went on for some days. I had not yet got to know my regiments, nor they me, so I marched sometimes with one, sometimes with another, so that I could watch them at work. The army crossed the Zbrouch and took up its position on the right bank, in close touch with the enemy. My men remained half a day's march to the west of the Zbrouch. I was under orders to stay there till nightfall if possible, so as to give the infantry time to dig trenches, after which I was to cross the river and concentrate my 2 divisions behind the line occupied by the infantry. At dawn, I learnt that my Cossack division was retreating, hard pressed by the enemy. An Austrian cavalry brigade, profiting by this retreat, deflected the right flank of the 7th Division, with which I was marching at the time. I ordered 3 regiments into the saddle, leaving the 4th to cover the artillery. From the top of a hill, I watched the enemy approaching at full trot. Shortly afterwards, a shell passed over our heads. The enemy had probably sighted our group of officers and was firing on us. I ordered the artillery to open an enfilade, and then set the 3 regiments on to the Austrians. The enemy turned tail without waiting for an encounter. At this moment, another brigade was turning our left flank. Leaving 1 regiment to pursue the enemy, I commanded the 3 regiments which remained to charge for the second time, and again the enemy withdrew before the onslaught. In the meanwhile, the Cossack division also went over to the offensive, overthrew the enemy, and again took up the position it had occupied the evening before. Until nighttime, the enemy would not attempt to attack us again, but would merely send over some large-caliber shells. I went down to one of my brigades, which was resting in the forest. The officers were sitting at table near a forester's hut. I had scarcely dismounted when a shell fell not far away. A wounded man groaned. A horse covered with blood galloped off at top speed. Several troopers came out of the wood in great haste. Others ran to their horses. There was nearly a panic. I gave the command, "Eyes front," sat down at the table, and picking up a fragment of a newly burst shell which had fallen quite near, I turned to the soldiers saying, "Who wants some hot rolls? Catch!" And I threw it to one of them. Then faces brightened, and a laugh ran along the ranks. They were no longer panicky. The firing soon ceased. We had only had 2 men killed and several horses wounded. The regiments set out for their camps. Then afterwards, I passed them at the gallop. I shouted a few words to them, and they cheered me enthusiastically. It was one of those psychological moments when officer and soldiers seem to be of one flesh. I have lived through other such unforgettable moments before and since, in Manchuria, in Eastern Prussia, in Galicia, in the Kuban, and in the Crimea. I do not know how these bonds are forged on the spur of the moment, always spontaneously and often without any apparent reason. One feels these things instinctively, though one cannot explain them. Without these bonds, there would be no army. It is not enough to have your men well in hand, they must be yours, so that they will follow you, not only from a sense of duty, but because something stronger than themselves stirs in their hearts and makes it impossible for them to do otherwise. The next day, we crossed the Zbrouch. The operations with which we had been entrusted were over. My cavalry was mentioned in dispatches. One fine day, the chief of the army staff telephoned me. One of our Caucasian infantry regiments had left its post, and the enemy could profit by this to make a breach and threaten Kamenets. Headquarters had been there, but had broken camp. I was ordered to save the situation. The 79th Infantry Division was to relieve me. I saw that the cavalry got on the march and found some ambulances and 30 cars in the car park, also 10 lorries for the general staff. Then I ordered a skirmishing regiment of the 7th Division to mount, and we set off. One of my Cossack regiments was already at grips with the enemy and master of a village which the Caucasians had abandoned. The Caucasians, who had retreated, were camping 4 kilometers from the battlefield. I ordered them to attack simultaneously with a brigade of the 7th Division, which was deployed onto the skirmishers. The enemy's artillery opened an enfilade, and suddenly I saw our Caucasians waver and take to flight all along the front. Our artillery sent over some shells, but this only hastened their retreat. I dispatched my lancers, who with their lances and the flat of their swords rounded up the men as if they had been a flock of sheep. I let them get their breath back and have some food. Then I made an encouraging speech to them, put myself at then head, and led them to the charge. At first they marched half-heartedly, then with spirit, and finally they charged with fixed bayonets. We took 300 prisoners and 4 machine guns. Unfortunately, my aide-de-camp and 2 of my orderly officers were seriously wounded. After the attack, I said to the chief of my general staff, "Now we can feel easy about the Caucasians. After such a success, the regiment will fight well." I was mistaken. That same night, they abandoned their position and took themselves off to the interior. Nevertheless, our cavalry succeeded in holding the head of the Khotan Bridge until the expected reinforcements came up. After this affair, whilst we are still on the subject, I received a telegram from the commander of the army. "Honor and glory to your cavalry corps, Cheremissov." Shortly afterwards, General Cheremissov was superseded by General Sokovnin. On July 16th, General Kornilov was appointed commander-in-chief of the Russian army. Kornilov. When Kornilov was made generalissimo, the army realized that at last it had a real leader. The high command felt that its authority would be restored and the soldier that he was going to be forced to obey. The powers of the soldiers' committees were curtailed. The men who made up these committees were not at all bad on the whole. After talking to them on many occasions, I came to the conclusion that if they were properly influenced and left politics alone, dealing only with practical questions, they might even be useful. Thus, the democratized commissariat frequently refused to hand over material when the commanders of formations asked for it, even when the troops were in pressing need, but they supplied the company delegates at the first demand. Zawiko wrote to me frequently. I learnt from him that in view of the desertions in the army, which were steadily on the increase in certain companies, Kornilov had demanded, amongst other things, that the death penalty, abolished by the Provisional Government, should be re-established for deserters and traitors at the front, as well as in the interior. The letter finished with these words: "The General charges me to tell you to be patient, and not to accuse us falsely of letting things slide. It is impossible to embark on anything before the winter." To my great astonishment, on August 10th or 12th, I received a telegram from Supreme Headquarters. "As you are to be appointed to a new post, you have now been put at the disposal of the commander of the armies on the Romanian front. At the same time, you are to keep the command of your cavalry corps." I could not make head or tail of the extremely strange wording of this telegram, so I telephoned Count Shuvalov and asked him to explain to me what it was intended to convey. He answered that nobody knew at Supreme Headquarters. The Generalissimo was at Moscow and was not returning for a few days. Then I received a telegram from Zawojko. "The Generalissimo is very pleased with you. An important post has been entrusted to you." The same day the order came to send off a brigade of the 3rd Caucasian Division to rejoin the Caucasian Division stationed at Deno II. On August 27th, I joined the General Staff as directed. I found them in an uproar. They had just received a proclamation from Kornilov addressed to the troops. In it he spoke of infamous treason and forbade the reception of any communications whatsoever from the President of the Ministerial Council. Kerensky's telegram accusing Kornilov of rebellion arrived some hours later. At the same time, headquarters ordered all the wireless apparatus to be taken away. The Army Committee protested against this order and were supported by Levitsky, the Quartermaster General. The commander of the army, General Sokovnin, and his chief of staff had lost their heads. With great difficulty, I obtained a copy of the Generalissimo's order. The commander of the army proposed that we should not let it become public until the situation was more settled. But he could not stand out against the committee and ordered the quartermaster not to allow the removal of the wireless. As I left the general staff, I saw General Levitsky triumphantly announcing his decision to members of the committees. I could not refrain from telling General Levitsky very sharply that I considered the non-execution of an order from the Generalissimo to be a crime, and that I would immediately order the removal of the apparatus from my general staff. The next morning, my aide-de-camp came and told me that the soldiers' committee of my 3rd Cossack Division was sitting, presided over by a demagogue priest whom I had tried to get removed many times. I went down and found General Odintsov, the commander of the division, there too. As I entered, I saluted the men, as I always do. "Good morning, Cossacks." The Cossacks answered me as usual. Then the priest-president said, "Will you please note, General, that the members here assembled are not Cossacks, as you call them, but citizens." "You are quite right, Father. We are all citizens. But that does not prevent my being a general, your being a priest, and their being brave Cossacks. That they are brave I know very well, because I have seen them in battle more than once, that they are Cossacks. I also know, for I myself have worn their uniform for years, and am proud of it." And turning to the assembly, once more, "Good morning, Cossacks." "Greetings, Your Excellency," they shouted as one man. I took my place at the president's table and requested Brigadier General Odintsov to acquaint me with the order of the day. He told me that they had just read Kerensky's telegram and were about to deliberate on the terms in which they were to let him know that the committee would support him. Splendid. And does the committee know about the commander-in-chief telegram? A fellow in a tunic, who was not a soldier at all, interrupted. "The Army Committee, of which I am the delegate, does not consider it necessary to communicate the telegram to the company committees." "This telegram," I said, "has been sent to me by the commander of the army, and I must communicate it to my brothers in arms. I will take the responsibility." The members of the Army Committee protested, but the majority shouted, "We want to hear it." I read the proclamation from Major General Kornilov. "And now, my men, you know all there is to know. I feel certain that you will do your duty as soldiers, and that you will reach a decision compatible with your conscience and your duty. As for myself, I am a soldier, and have nothing to do with politics. My Generalissimo's orders are law to me. I am sure that your divisional commander will tell you the same thing." I looked at Odintsov. At last he stammered out, dropping his eyes. "I, like all the Cossacks, my children." With great difficulty, I restrained myself from supplementing this faint-hearted remark, and taking leave of the Cossacks, I went out to my car. As I was getting into my car, Odintsov dashed up. I was so startled that really, without answering him, I told the chauffeur to drive off. After long consultations, the 3rd Cossack Division declared for Kerensky. The 7th Division did not come to any decision until the evening. The next day, headquarters, which was losing more and more ground to the committees, decreed that the telephones and telegraphs were to be put under the direct control of the soldiers' committees. Furthermore, no orders coming from the commanding officers were to be valid unless countersigned by a member of the committee. It was the last straw. I galloped over to headquarters and procured an interview with the commander of the army. "Your Excellency, your decree is a crime for an officer. I cannot possibly obey it, so I beg you to let me resign my commission." "General, you are not thinking of doing that." "I am thinking of doing one of 3 things, either of giving a counter-order, or of resigning my duties, or of saddling the 7th Division and having a little chat with the committees face to face." General Sokovnin said that he would try and arrange something. That same day, he sent me what was in effect a counter-order. On September 5th, a telegram from General Shcherbachov, Commander-in-Chief on the Romanian front, ordered me to go at once to Jassy. Shcherbachov had been the head of the military college where I had studied. He told me that, knowing my relations with Kornilov, he had sent for me so that should any unforeseen contingency arise, I should be with him, and therefore, according to him, safe. 2 days later, a telegram from the Chief of Staff at Supreme Headquarters informed me that, by an order of September 9th, the Generalissimo had appointed me commander of the 3rd Cavalry. The following days were a nightmare to me. Kornilov was convicted of rebellion and imprisoned. General Krymov, who had been put at the head of the troops which were marching on the capital, committed suicide. Kerensky the barrister, the revolutionary generalissimo, democracy's hostage in the Provisional Government, was at the head of the army. All these events had shaken the morale of the troops very badly. The projected appointment of General Alexeyev as chief of the Supreme General Staff was the only glimmer of hope left. If Alexeyev had consented to this appointment, all would not have been lost. Anxious for the fate of Count Polin and the officers of our organization, I made a hasty journey to the capital. 3. The last days of the Provisional Government. The first thing I did when I arrived was to call on the General Staff of the Military District of Petersburg. There I met General Krasnov, whom I had known during the Russo-Japanese War. When I told him of my recent appointment, he was lost in astonishment. "But, my dear fellow, I have just been appointed to that very post." It was somewhat disconcerting, but it did not surprise me. At this period, when everything was going to the devil, incidents like this often occurred. To get the matter cleared up, I asked the chief of the military district, Colonel Polkovnikov, who had been chief of staff in my Usurian division, what the cause of the mistake was. He told me that in his opinion, the order appointing me was of a more recent date than that appointing Krasnov, and that therefore, probably, it was I who should take the command, but he knew nothing definite. He gave me the details of Krymov's suicide. It was said that the breach between the minister-president and the generalissimo had been absolutely unexpected by Krymov himself and by his troops. It was only whilst he had been stationed at Dno that he had received Kerensky's telegram proclaiming General Kornilov a traitor. According to Polkovnikov, if Krymov had continued his advance on the capital resolutely, Petersburg could have been taken. Unfortunately, General Krymov, taken unawares, worn out by recent events, and distracted by private affairs, had begun to lose his head. He had delayed and sent to headquarters for instructions, thus losing precious time. Just a day too late, he had realized that success was not a foregone conclusion. General Krymov agreed to go to Petersburg to negotiate with Kerensky, who had sent him an invitation via General Samarin, the leader of the Minister of War's cabinet. He had gone to Kerensky's house, and a stormy interview had ensued. He had then gone straight on to see an officer he knew. There he had asked for writing material and begged leave to be left alone. A few minutes later, an explosion had been heard. They found the general with a bullet in his chest. He had left a letter for his wife. When asked why he had taken his own life, he answered, "I want to die because I love my country too much." He died the same evening. I left the general's staff and went on to the new club to get news of Count Polin. He had come back the day before. According to him, Krymov's movement on Petersburg had come at a moment when his organization was quite unprepared. At the time, no one had expected a conflict between the government and the Generalissimo, and consequently, no one had been prepared for it. Immediately after the rupture, an absolutely unknown colonel, who was unfurnished with documents and refused to give his name, had appeared in Petersburg saying that Krymov had sent him. Polin, fearing that he was nothing more nor less than an agent provocateur, had promptly refused to negotiate with him. Polkovnikov begged me to spend the evening with him. Verkhovsky, the new Minister of War, found it impossible to give me a command near the capital in view of my personal character and for political reasons. Therefore, I was to be given another somewhere else. I demanded my discharge. It was refused. There is no discharge in the war. I took the matter to the Minister of War. He told me the same thing. Finally, I went to the Chief of the General Staff. I was ordered to report at Supreme Headquarters immediately. There, they offered me various appointments. I refused, realizing that I could be of no service to my country in the existing circumstances. At the end of October, the Bolshevists broke up the Provisional Government. Kerensky fled, disguised as a sailor, deserting his colleagues, the army, and Russia. At last, I received my discharge papers and left Mogilev for the Crimea to join my wife and children as a private individual.